Hello, and welcome to the Rolling Blounts podcast, episode 2. I'm your co-host, Jalen Brader.
And I'm Ariel, and today we're going to be talking about mass incarceration. Before we get started, we do want to give a content warning that we will be talking about incarceration and possibly police brutality and racial violence in this episode.
So let's get started. First, I would like to talk about a poet I have found that talks really hard on mass incarceration, specifically the inequalities going on in our prison system. And his name is Reginald Dwayne Betts. He was an African-American poet that was put into jail for an armed carjacking at the age of 16. Tried as an adult, sentenced to 8+ years in prison, 14 of which he spent in solitary confinement. And his poems reflect his personal experiences on what he went through in prison, the experiences, how he found poetry, because when he was in solitary confinement, someone had slipped an anthology of African American poets under his door, and that's where he found his his creative spark to become a writer and a poet. But when looking at his poems, you can see how traumatized his prison experience has made him. He talks about a good number of things, like how he watched some of his buddies be attacked by these prison guards, and he speaks up about the disproportionate rate African Americans are being jailed by the system and then tossed out without any care. They're still prisoners on the inside, and society sees them as prisoners. And another one of his works, in Alabama, discusses how it is the policy of Alabama to keep people in prison.
After prison. Name a song, tell a man what to expect after prison. Something that says you're still a suspect after prison. Titus Kaffar painted my portrait, then dipped it in black tar. He knows redaction is a dialect after prison. From inside a cell, the night sky isn't the measure. That's why it's prison's vastness your eyes reflect after prison. My lover don't believe in my sadness. She says whiskey and that time is what left me wrecked after prison. Ruth, paper maker, take these tattered grays, make paper of my bed, a past I won't reject after prison.
1619 is the first recorded year that enslaved Africans were brought to what would become the United States. Until 1865 and the passing of the 13th Amendment, millions of people were enslaved in the United States. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery except as punishment for a crime. In response, southern states began passing black codes that punished only black people for things like vagrancy or breaking curfew. The result? Black people were put back into chains. Convict leasing. Birmingham, Alabama's largest city, boomed because of the mining industry. By the 1880s, almost all incarcerated individuals in the leasing system were working in the coal industry around the Magic City. During the height of convict leasing, 90 to 95% of laboring individuals were black, and physical punishment such as whipping were an acceptable practice. Alabama was the last state to finally abolish convict leasing in 1928, following years of outcry about the corruption of the system and dangerous working conditions. Chain gangs, group of incarcerated people chained together at the ankles performing public works like repairing roads, continued into 1955. Between 1926 and 1940, state prison populations across the U.S. rose 67%. In the mid-1990s, Alabama conducted what was called a chain gang experiment and reintroduced the practice for a year. It was stopped after lawyers of the incarcerated came to an agreement with the state. In a 1996 New York Times article, a representative of the Southern Poverty Law Center said they realized that chaining them together was inefficient, that it was unsafe, and they ended the practice. In the 1960s and 70s, a tough-on-crime attitude began to form when politicians like Nixon and Johnson connected street crime with civil rights activism. In the 70s, a national recession hitting black families the hardest pushed them into red-line districts where criminalization was only exacerbated in the following decades, and we began to see the rise of what we know as mass incarceration. The war on drugs, most commonly attributed to President Reagan, was a driving force for the privatization of prisons, harsher sentencing, and the recognition of drug use as a crime issue rather than a mental health crisis. During his time in office, mass incarceration doubled. In 1994, Bill Clinton passed the federal crime bill, which allowed states to pass more tough-on-crime legislation. This legislation followed years of competition between Democrats and Republicans who competed to prove their dedication to what they saw as the issue of criminality. Some of the things included were allowing the death penalty for more crimes, implementing the 3 strikes law where individuals with 3 felony convictions can be charged with life sentences, and better ability to charge kids as adults. The bill subsidized $12 billion for building more prisons. Today, Alabama has the largest incarceration rate in the world. 946 out of every 100,000 people in our state are incarcerated. The U.S. is the country with the largest incarceration rate, with 698 out of every 100,000 people incarcerated. Black people make up 24% of the state population in Alabama, but are 54% of the prison population. As we are recording this, Alabama Governor Kay Ivey is working on a plan to build 3 new private men's prisons in Bibb, Elmore, and Escambia County. This is the response to the Alabama prison crisis. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, our prison homicide rate is 10 times the national average. Incarcerated people in Alabama face severe overcrowding, staff shortages, and a lack of rehabilitative services. An ACLU report released at the beginning of 2020 said that 92% of people scheduled for parole hearings since September 2019 were denied release. Parole is the primary way we see a decrease in prison populations. Since 2018, there has been a steep decline in parole releases. This has meant that our custody population is steadily growing. Alabama prisons are under federal investigation for cruel punishment and unconstitutional conditions. The Department of Justice has continuously said that the planned 3 new prisons will not solve the issue, and yet here we are. So I just wanted to give y'all a brief overview of mass incarceration, how we got to where we are, and a few contextual pieces of Alabama's role in mass incarceration. Obviously, I did not cover everything that I probably needed to, but again, this podcast is only 30 to 45 minutes, so unfortunately we don't have the time to delve deep into those issues.
But we can still look at some of the things.
Yeah,
like,
we can still look at some of those things.
Why is the solution more prisons?
Right. And we can definitely see, looking at like Mr. Bett's poetry, how the decisions that have been made as far as like the criminal punishment system or the criminal justice system, I prefer the first name, have affected people on like a real personal level. So what does that mean for us, and what does that mean for investigating mass incarceration in context of our little liberal arts class?
So we can see that the prison system is a big part of our culture.
Yeah, one might argue that it's actually an integral part of the makeup of society in the United States.
Why have prisons? What are we doing with prisons? We're putting the people who go against the norms of society there because it's deemed as bad or evil of what they're doing, which violating a crime, depending on your morals, could go either way.
Yeah, so let's get into some theory.
Let's get into some theory.
So me and Jalen, surprisingly, have been reading. I know, big shock to everyone. So Discipline and Punish by Foucault is one of the... I mean, it changed the way that people looked at crime and looked at power structures. And this was kind of written in like a Marxist context. So you're looking at things from the idea that everything is meant to maintain a basically disciplined working class. So one of the big things that Foucault puts forward is that, incarceration is historically contingent on changing power structures. So in my long and drawn out history that I just recited to y'all, we can see that changing power structures did have an effect on the way that we looked at punishment.
Mm-hmm. And who's it disproportionately affecting?
Exactly. So something interesting that, in this podcast we're talking about the way that some of these issues have affected us. Fortunately, Jalen and I have not been to prison, but we can see that the power structures in place to maintain these systems of mass incarceration have permeated in other areas of life. So Foucault makes this argument about observation. And the observation, what he calls le regard, is like a key element of power. And even down to the very design of prisons, where they're structured so that a guard could be watching you at any time but you don't know, it shows that idea that the way that we keep discipline is by instilling a certain fear in people.
Mm-hmm. That fear can exist anywhere. Being an African American man, I was taught by my parents to make sure you watch yourself around cops, because you could just be driving down the road and one pull you over and start badgering you or trying to instigate you to commit a crime. I've been taught that, and it's been a mindset of mine to always obey the law, because I'm going to be put into prison and that will ruin my life forever.
Yeah, and I think that that's what Foucault is getting at, is that we have a certain perception of freedom, which, depending on what you believe, is that even real? And with this freedom, there's this constant fear that we also could have it stripped from us. And the way that those in power maintain that power by keeping that fear.
So what Foucault also says on the history of punishment is that before we had these prison systems, it was a way for the king to exert his power onto his people, because punishment was public. You would have executions in the street, beatings in the street, to show to these violators that their actions do not fall in line with that of the king.
Yeah, and then that sort of transitioned, and you had people who saw that as wrong, and so you had reformers. But what Foucault wonders is if that was truly a good reform, because then you have this more efficient system of punishment that eventually got us where we are, where it's really a whole industry.
Speaking on reform, another big reform for the prison system is putting women in correctional facilities as wardens. I remember there was a big thing about having African American females as wardens to push for a more caring and empathetic way of dealing with the prisoners, because women they're more caring than men, and they would treat the prisoners more humanely. But there was a study conducted on women and female or women and male wardens, and if women were actually more humane and caring than males, and what the study found, the differences between them were few, even on like ideologies. If they were conservatives or liberals, it didn't change their middle of the road philosophy that prison is for incapacitation and not for rehabilitation.
Right. And I think that kind of goes into, like, recently in our worldviews class, we read Althusser, and we talked about the state apparatus, and then we talked about the ideological state apparatus. Mm-hmm. And there's something very deceptive about the way that we maintain the perception of prisons and of mass incarceration and that whole system. And you speak of it like with this recent case of reform is, you know, Foucault argues that the prison system and punishment are all an element of power. And he says there's no way, as a Marxist does, there's no way we can escape this system unless it's completely overthrown. So I'm not sure he really believes in abolition, but the core beliefs of abolition, especially in regards to the prison system, is there's no way to reform it. And so when people say, like, oh, we'll introduce these reforms, like putting women who are probably more compassionate, more empathetic into prisons, that's sort of part of what Althusser is saying when he says that ideology operates as an arm of the state, because you're convincing people that you can make this immense system of power better by putting individuals in place who are nicer. But you still, at the end of the day, have this very harmful, like, violent system of incarceration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there reform for the system? I don't believe so. From like what we see, or from what more of that study showed me, is that a lot of the influences on wardens to make decisions on whether we should reduce prison amenities being like having higher education classes or martial arts courses to teach the prisoners self-defense. The influences to reduce those amenities came from the governor, it came from the executive board running the prison, or it came from the courts. And it was like 1% of male wardens reported it was their own actions that led to the reduction of prison amenities, and 0% of females. So reform is not coming. If you reform the prison, that's not fixing much. You have to shoot higher. You would have to aim higher and reform the people making the policies.
Yeah, and I mean, in the time that we're recording this podcast and following the summer, I think we've, like, abolition, especially police abolition, prison abolition, have come to the forefront of conversation, and you see how scared people are of that concept, which, as I think I mentioned earlier, like, Foucault just doesn't think abolition is possible because we are so entrenched in the system, and it is an arm of what Althusser and other Marxists call the superstructure, with a base in, like, economic value. So it's hard to escape that system without a complete overhaul of it. So even if we did abolish prisons, which I would be happy about, you would still, I think something else would replace it. So we would have to overthrow the entire capitalistic system in order to get rid of it.
Let anarchy reign, baby.
Yeah.
So, Angela Davis does make a good counter argument to the idea that the system is unescapable in saying the fact that we have embraced ideas such as defying the gender norms with trans people and breaking out of the binary binary like ideas that it's only male and female, that we can embrace the idea of like prison abolition as well. It's just the fear of control is very strong, because I personally would not know what would like replace it. Like, okay, so police and prisons are gone. Do I have to follow the law then? Am I still a law-abiding citizen if there's no one watching me commit a crime? And I think that fear is like very big in people, in knowing that, especially being in Alabama with people judging you on the site if you look suspicious. It's complicated to think what would replace it, because you have to figure out what's going to replace it, for one, and two, you have to make sure people are okay with embracing, hey, there's no more prison.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's the thing about it, because when I say to people, like, we don't need police anymore, we have surpassed the need for police, which I think the reason that abolition scares people is because they think that the idea is, oh, poof, like it's gone, and we just burn it all down. But that's not at all what it is. And it's the fear that, well, if I don't call police, then who do I call? And so I think the response, especially that I've seen in Alabama, is a lot of people hate cops. Like, they hate the prison system. They have family members that are incarcerated. They know about the racial disparities in prisons. They know that trans people are being murdered in prisons. They know all these things, but they also have this deep and immense respect for police officers because there's no other options. And Foucault talks about the development of the penitentiary and how that has marginalized people, because no longer is like punishment meant to just reform people. It's also meant to be your mental health care facility. It's meant to be all of these things. It's where people get their labor, as we've seen with convict leasing. And so it's been successful because it doesn't produce reformed citizens. It reproduces failure, because people come out of the prisons likely like in a more, the prisons produce the violence that the ruling class has convinced us that they're there to solve, essentially. And that's the scary thing, is when, you know, Angela Davis talks about abolition and she talks about the breakdown of the binary, that's because she is seeing the fact that we have to break down these power structures in every possible place. And I mean, that starts within us. We have to break down our internal power structures and barriers that have been placed to discipline literally our bodies.
And Bet gives us a view of what happens to the individual after prison. A lot of his writing, he talks about how he's drinking so he doesn't have to remember his time. He struggles with the idea that he can be a father and a lover to his wife while also being a felon. And at times, he says he fails to be a lover to his wife or a father of his kids because he's so busy thinking about his time in prison that he can't think of anything. It scarred him. It traumatized him. And he's like, how can I be a felon and in society? Because that label does not leave you. People are always going to see you as a criminal and question your behavior, even when you're on the outside. You're supposed to be reformed. Your time's supposed to make you better, but people think that, oh, you haven't spent enough time in there.
Yeah. And before filming, you mentioned that Bet's nickname in prison was the Arabic word for witness. So he was or is aware that these systems are in place to harm people and to keep people oppressed. And going back to Althusser, it's amazing how well the state apparatus and the ruling class has convinced all of society that, like, prisons have a purpose, or that certain groups of people are inherently violent. And I mean, think about how normalized shows like Cops are, and just the image of police officers, and it's kind of wild.
And like recently, there's been big backlash against shows like Cops and like Live PD because it's just promoting more of the violence that people are speaking out against. And is it a fault of the cops, or is it a fault of the people in power?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think that we're never going to see a world where people think that abolition is possible until they become aware that there are alternatives. But it's so hard to imagine a world where we turn back on this capitalistic, hierarchical, bureaucratic system that we've built, because as we've seen, I mean, in all of the readings we've had this semester, as you see through the very beginning of like anthropological theory, anything that is not structured and bureaucratic is seen as savagery. Any society that relies on a communal structure, that relies on, you know, the group, and I would argue empathy, is seen as savagery. And you don't see, you know, this higher level of community organization until you get into
civilized society.
Yeah, and they only refer to Western culture as civilized. But I don't know what that really means, because if civilized is jailing people, civilized is producing people like Reginald Dwayne Betts, who feels like he can't be a father to his children, then what is it really achieving?
It's achieving keeping those who have the power to keep that power. And throughout this podcast, we've discussed them, the ruling class, and they, and we've used these ambiguous terms, but who are they? Who has this power?
Yeah.
We could say a lot of things here. We could say, oh, it's the politicians. Oh, it's the conservatives who are making sure that blacks remain second-class citizens. Or we can say a bunch of things, but I believe we kind of have our answer of who they is.
Well, and we're entering a new period of questioning these things, because a lot of left-sided people are praising the introduction of our new president, Joe Biden, but he sponsored the crime bill that I mentioned in my my
history
intro earlier. And his VP, you know, called herself top cop of California. So that also offers new questions about, like, the goodness of our system. Mm-hmm. And I think that our generation, no matter what side you lean towards, are recognizing that the two-party system isn't working. Mm-hmm. And I hope that that means we're entering a world where the breakdown and burning of the system is possible, but I just don't know about that one.
Is it possible we're exiting money politics?
No, absolutely not.
Oh, no, I had a little bit of hope. I was like, yes, finally, a world where money doesn't decide everything. People won't remain in prison for money because they can't pay their court fines. People won't have to slave away to earn money as a way to be a part of society. Our politicians wouldn't be controlled by money yet.
Yeah, and that's the thing I kind of threw out there earlier, was the fact that all of mass incarceration is in this bigger capitalistic system. And everything we've seen from convict leasing was making states like hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's terms. And then chain gangs were performing work for the state system. So those were people they didn't have to pay. Even today, corporations like Starbucks and Walmart use incarcerated people as laborers for them. And then, of course, we have systems like cash bail that inherently criminalize poverty because there's people sitting in jail because they can't pay $100. So the big question is, what does that mean for Alabama? Because we're one of the poorest states in the country.
Yeah, it says we're making money off of our prisoners, and what do we have outside of that? We said earlier, Alabama's policy is to keep people in prison, and with the addition of 3 new private prisons, we're going to be making bank. But off of what? Denying people their freedom because we're a little low on funds?
Yeah, and something about that is, like, these prisons aren't going to be ready until, I think, like 2030 or 20 something up there. So they're literally building prisons for kindergartners. It's not about the crimes that these people are committing. It's about maintaining that power.
And pushing more delinquents out into society.
Right.
If we have a society of delinquents and then we're ruled over those who consider themselves, I don't know what you would call them, if you have a society of delinquents and the people ruling over it are not delinquents. So what does that make it?
What is delinquency? It's this category that the ruling class has created, basically just to control everyone else out of fear that they'll end up like them. Mm-hmm.
It's another borderland. Mm-hmm. It's another barrier we perceive to separate us from the savages. If we're not a delinquent, we're civilized.
Right. Well, next episode we're talking about education.
Woo!
And one big arm of the prison industrial complex, the one contributor to mass incarceration, one arm of the criminal punishment system is the school to prison pipeline. So we may get into some of that. Mm-hmm. But until then,
stay tuned.
Question power and
abolish prison.
And we'll talk to you later.